At approximately 2 a.m. on August 5, 1944, on a bright moonlit night, a Japanese prisoner ran up to the guards in a prisoner of war camp in Cowra, Australia, apparently shouting some sort of warning. Moments later, a bugle started playing inside the compound. The largest prison break of the Second World War had begun. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Thousands of POWs and enemy aliens were interned in Australia during the Second World War, housed in more than 50 camps. The camp near Cowra in the central west region of New South Wales, some 300 kilometers from Sydney, was prisoner of war compound number 12 and began operating in June 1941. The camp covered more than 74 acres and housed around 4,000 prisoners, mostly Japanese and Italian prisoners of war, but there were also some Koreans, Chinese, and Indonesians. The camp was roughly circular and divided by two roads. One, called No Man's Land, ran roughly east-west, while one called Broadway, so called because it was brightly lit at night, ran north to south. This created 4 compounds, labeled A through D. Each of the compounds was initially designed for around 1,000 prisoners, and contained up to 20 barrack-like huts in rows. The compounds were surrounded by barbed wire fences, while the whole camp was surrounded by 3 perimeter fences with several meters of entangled barbed wire between them. The camp perimeter was dominated by 6 guard towers, each about 9 meters high and regularly patrolled by armed guards. Compounds A and C were occupied by Italian prisoners. Captured in the Middle East, the Italians were content to sit out the war in a POW camp. One former guard described the prisoners as a friendly, happy crowd of Italians who gave little or no trouble. They'd fought tenaciously in battle, but found no dishonor in captivity and saw it simply as part of the war. Their attitude towards capture was in stark contrast to the Japanese POWs. Compound D included Japanese officers and other prisoners, mainly laborers who had been conscripted by the Japanese from Korea, China, and Formosa and had been captured. Compound B housed Japanese non-commissioned officers and lower ranks. In mid-1944, B Compound was the most populated in the camp, with over 1,100 internees. The guards were from the Australian Militia's 22nd Garrison Battalion, commanded by Group Commandant Montague Brown, a lieutenant colonel and a veteran of the First World War. Each of the 4 compounds within the camp was overseen by a garrison company, commanded by a major, each with a complement of approximately 100 men. The garrison battalion was mostly comprised of men too old for service, or younger men who were physically disabled. Guard Wall McKenzie, for example, had a permanent limp caused by a farming accident, while his friend Seaforth McKenzie was blind in one eye. Barracks and facilities for the garrison troops were contained in compounds outside the camp, at either end of Broadway and at the western end of No Man's Land. The guards were armed with mostly older rifles, but the camp had recently been provided 2 Vickers machine guns and several light machine guns. The 2 large Vickers machine guns were placed along the stretches of the wire fence around B Compound. The first Japanese POWs came to Cowra in January 1943. The prisoners in Camp B, led by camp leader Sergeant Major Kanazawa, were mostly captured in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Private Turo Murakami, for example, just 18 years old, had only recently been captured by American troops on the New Guinea island of New Britain. In the close-quarters jungle warfare of the Pacific, few prisoners were taken. Japanese soldiers taken by this point in the war often had been captured while they were largely incapacitated, suffering from the effects of malnutrition or disease. Others had been rescued after their ships had been sunk or their planes shot down. One such prisoner of Camp 12 was somewhat of a celebrity. Sergeant Hajime Toyoshima was the first Japanese prisoner of war captured in Australia during the war. Flying an A6M20 from the aircraft carrier Hiryu, Toyoshima had participated in the bombing of Darwin, Australia in February 1942. The attack was the largest single attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australia, sinking 11 vessels and damaging 25 more, as well as doing significant damage to the city of Darwin. The Japanese had only lost 4 aircraft in the attack, one being Toyoshima's Mitsubishi Zero, which was the first Zero recovered by the Allies relatively intact. Toyoshima, the first Japanese POW in Australia, was the prisoner blowing the bugle that signaled the breakout attempt. The breakout was not due to camp conditions. The Australians had maintained the camp according to Red Cross and Geneva Convention standards. Murakami, in fact, described the camp life as heavenly. Prisoners played mahjong using tiles they created themselves. Another pastime for the Japanese prisoners was playing baseball with carved bats and hand-fashioned leather baseball mitts. In many ways, the guards could not even fathom that there would be an escape attempt. While they knew there was dissatisfaction among the Japanese prisoners and relations were not as good as with the Italian POWs, the conditions in the camp were good and the prospects for escape nearly suicidal. But the Japanese prisoners had a deeper motivation. As Japanese soldiers, they had a code, and that code included the words, "Do not take the shame of capture in life." To a Japanese soldier, being captured alive was highly shameful, and in fact, many thought they could never return to their families with such shame. Afraid to let their families know that they'd been captured alive, many gave false names or ranks. They knew their families would have been informed that they had died in battle, and that funeral services would have been undertaken and tombstones erected in their hometowns and villages. Just being associated with a traitor who had allowed himself to be captured alive could have threatened their family's immediate future. Thus, the Japanese prisoners felt that they had nothing to return to, and nothing to lose. One of the reasons that Japan had refused to sign the Geneva Convention in 1929 regarding the treatment of prisoners of war was because the Japanese thought that it would be an unfair burden upon them. As Japanese service members were expected never to be taken alive, the Japanese believed that their enemies would never have to take care of Japanese POWs. The POWs saw it as their duty to escape not only as a matter of military service, but as a matter of personal honor. As one survivor described it, "As Japanese servicemen, we had to choose death. We couldn't keep living indefinitely with the shame of being captured. We were branded with the combatant's code, the core of military discipline." While many of the camp guards saw humane treatment of prisoners as their Christian duty, the Japanese prisoners often saw it as a sign of weakness, and some later said that they believed that they were only treated well to avoid retaliation against the guards once Japan won the war. But the camp guards had caught wind from a camp informant that the prisoners may be planning something, and an uprising at a POW camp in New Zealand had sparked the need for greater security. Australia decided to split the lower ranks from their non-commissioned officers, sending the lower ranks to another camp. Sergeant Major Kanazawa was informed of the impending move on August 4th. That evening, approximately 50 of the senior prisoners of war in B Compound met to discuss the response to the proposed move. The debate centered on whether to seize the opportunity to mount an attack on the Australian guards, thus providing an occasion for the prisoners to regain their honor by dying in battle. In the end, the leaders decided to put it to a vote of all the prisoners in the compound. Some 80% voted to attempt the break. Discussion with survivors suggests that many were intimidated into their vote and that there may have been more opposition than it appeared. But once the vote was taken, the whole camp was committed. The hastily made plan called for the breakout to commence at 2 a.m., signaled by a bugle call. They would first set fire to the barracks houses, and then attack by the light of the fires. The prisoners would use whatever weapons they could improvise, and attack the B perimeter fence in 3 places. If they escaped, the plan was to attack a nearby military training camp. The goal was to die honorably. Most carried razor blades, which would be used to slit their own throats to prevent recapture. Under the terms of the escape plan, the prisoners agreed that injured and incapacitated prisoners could restore their honor by committing suicide prior to the escape, and that no civilian would be harmed. One prisoner came out early in an apparent attempt to warn the guards. A guard fired 2 warning shots, alerting the camp. Then Sergeant Toyoshima started blowing his bugle, and the prisoners charged, shouting, "Banzai!" The machine guns started firing from the towers. Guard Will Mackenzie recalled that the noise of the screaming Japanese and gunfire was unbelievable. The prisoners were using blankets, winter coats, and their leather baseball gloves to protect themselves from the barbed wire. Some would throw themselves over the wire, making a path for those behind them. They carried an array of makeshift weapons, bats, clubs, cooking utensils. The crew of the No. 2 Vickers gun, Privates Ben Hardy and Ralph Jones, were awoken by the warning shots and quickly covered the 50 or so meters to the gun. They were confronted by a mass of Japanese headed towards them over the fences, which had been covered with blankets. With no covering fire in support, and despite 5 minutes of concentrated fire into the onrushing prisoners, Hardy and Jones were overrun and beaten to death. Before they were overrun, Private Jones had managed to remove and conceal the lock to the gun, preventing the prisoners from turning it on the other guards. Stray fire knocked out the power, and the flight was illuminated by the burning barracks in the bright moon. Another guard, Private Charles Shepard, was killed, stabbed in the chest near the Camp B guardroom. A large group of prisoners was pinned down by machine gun fire on Broadway. They occasionally mounted attacks, but the crossfire was too much. Hajime Toyoshima died in one of those attacks. The firing was intense for the first hour, but quickly died down. Troops came from the nearby training camp, assisting in securing the camp. The dawn showed the devastation. Most of the sleeping huts in B compound were destroyed, and the bodies of over 100 prisoners lay along Broadway, draped over and near the perimeter fences and around No. 2 Vickers gun. A further 40 or so bodies lay among the buildings of B Company or were scattered in the field to the north of camp. Some prisoners, unwilling to attack the guards, had committed suicide by hanging themselves in the camp. Many of the wounded in the field had either killed themselves or been killed by comrades. A prisoner named Furukawa Keniichi later described how he had tried to kill himself by stabbing himself in the chest, but had missed his heart. In all, 231 prisoners died in the escape attempt and ensuing roundup. 108 were wounded. 330 prisoners made it outside the camp. By comparison, 76 airmen escaped in the more well-known escape from Luftstalag 3 in March 1944. It took 9 days to fully recover the missing Japanese POWs. One Australian officer, Lieutenant Harry Doncaster, was killed in the roundup, overwhelmed by a group of escapees. True to their word, the escaped POWs did not harm a single civilian. In fact, many Australian civilians gave food to the hungry prisoners, although 4 prisoners were killed by civilians. Many of the prisoners committed suicide rather than face recapture. At least 2 threw themselves in front of an oncoming train, but others, when they were caught, simply gave up. After the escape attempt, the fight had gone out of them. When the Japanese government was informed by Australia of the deaths of the prisoners, the Japanese refused to admit that there even could be Japanese POWs and accused the Australians of killing Japanese civilians. While most of the survivors of Cowra camp were eventually accepted by their families, Private Murakami said, "My family told me when I returned that a ghost had come back from war." Getting over the stigma of being captured alive has still been a difficult path in Japan. One Japanese historian who was attending a memorial at Cowra in 2014 estimated that 95% of the Japanese population still has never heard of the breakout at Cowra. However, the Japanese ambassador to Australia at that event said, "We will never allow the horrors of the last century's history to repeat themselves." The prisoners who died in the breakout attempt at Cowra are buried in a cemetery at Cowra that was opened in 1964 between the Japanese ambassador and the Australian War Graves Commission and is the only Japanese war cemetery overseas. Nearby in the Australian War Cemetery lie the graves of the 4 Australians that were killed in the breakout attempt. Privates Hardy and Jones were posthumously awarded the George's Cross. The town of Cowra has tried to find reconciliation since the camp closed when the last Italian prisoners were repatriated in 1947. In addition to the Japanese cemetery, a commemorative Japanese garden was later built on Bellevue Hill to memorialize these events. Tura Murakami was recaptured and taken back to the burned barracks at Cowra camp. He fully expected to be executed for attempting to escape, but instead was instructed to start cleaning the mess up. In 2014, he was the last of the Japanese survivors of Cowra camp to be in good enough health to return for the 70th anniversary commemoration of the breakout at Cowra. The Sydney Morning Herald asked him at what point he realized that death was not the only option. The 93-year-old responded, "I really don't know, but I am extremely happy that I survived." I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.